The son who cut ties with his father receives something unexpected. What happens next transforms their lives in a surprising way. A call that Daniel Parker never expected to receive changes everything. His father, Robert, from whom he distanced himself years ago, resurfaces with news that shakes all of Daniel's certainties. On a journey of reconciliation filled with tensions and revelations, Daniel discovers a side of his father he never knew. But is there still time to heal the wounds of the past? Daniel Parker, a 35-year-old man, lived alone in a small apartment in Portland, Oregon. His daily routine was meticulous. Work as a systems analyst during the day and quiet nights spent reading books or watching movies. Daniel's life was, in some ways, comfortable, but it carried with it a void he could never fill. A hole left by the abrupt break with his father, Robert, more than a decade ago. Daniel's relationship with his father had always been complicated. Since childhood, he felt that Robert was distant and controlling, rarely expressing affection or emotional support. Daniel's mother, Claire, had been the mediator between them, but her premature death when Daniel was only 15 left an irreplaceable void in the family. Without Claire, the relationship between father and son quickly deteriorated. Robert, consumed by grief, plunged into authoritarian behavior, exacerbating the already tense relationship with Daniel. The final break occurred when Daniel was 24. After a heated argument about life choices and careers, Daniel decided to sever ties completely with his father. He moved to Portland, and since then, they exchanged no more than a few formal words at inevitable family events. Daniel convinced himself that the distance was best for both of them, protecting himself from the emotional wounds that Robert seemed to inflict effortlessly. In the years that followed, Daniel focused on building his life. He had friends, a stable job, and a routine that kept him busy. But deep down, he knew something was missing. There was a persistent bitterness he couldn't shake, a simmering anger that sometimes surfaced out of nowhere, even in the most trivial situations. It was a typical autumn afternoon when something unexpected happened. Daniel was working from home, finishing a report for work, when his phone rang. The number was unknown, something he would normally ignore. But for some reason, this time he answered. "Hello?" said Daniel, while continuing to type with his other hand. On the other end of the line, a hesitant voice replied, "Daniel, it's your father." Daniel froze. He didn't know what to say. It had been so long since he heard that voice, and hearing his father again brought a wave of conflicting emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion, all mixed inside him. "Dad?" he replied, the incredulity clear in his voice. "What do you want?" Robert took a deep breath on the other end of the line. "I know it's been a long time, and I didn't end things in the best way, but I need to talk to you, son. Can we meet? I really want to have a conversation." Daniel hesitated. He had spent so many years trying to forget his father, bury the past, and move on. But something in Robert's voice, perhaps the vulnerability he had never heard before, made Daniel reconsider. Even though he didn't want to admit it, part of him was curious. Why was his father calling now, after so many years of silence? "Okay," Daniel finally replied, surprised by his own words. "We can meet, but I'm not promising anything." They agreed to meet in Seattle, where Robert was living now. Daniel hung up the phone with a heavy heart, still trying to process what had just happened. He knew that the meeting could reopen old wounds, but at the same time, he felt that this was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. In the days that followed, Daniel prepared for the trip to Seattle. He mentally rehearsed all the things he wanted to say to his father, the accusations and resentments he had held onto for so long. At the same time, he couldn't help but feel a certain anxiety, a part of him that hoped, albeit reluctantly, that this meeting might bring some form of closure. As Daniel drove through the busy streets of Seattle, the noise of the city contrasted with the inner silence he maintained. The cafe where he and Robert had agreed to meet was a small establishment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, surrounded by trees and with a discreet charm. Daniel parked the car but remained seated for a few minutes, trying to calm his mind. What would he say to his father? What would his father say to him? The uncertainty was overwhelming. Finally, he got out of the car and entered the cafe. The aroma of fresh coffee and the soft murmur of customers' conversations greeted him, but he barely noticed. His eyes soon found Robert, sitting at a table in the corner, near the window. Time had left its mark on Robert. His graying hair was thinner, and he seemed to have lost weight. But what caught Daniel's attention the most were his father's eyes. They looked more tired, as if they carried the weight of many years of regret. Daniel walked over to the table, his breath quickening with each step. When he finally sat down, there was an awkward silence, where both avoided each other's gaze. Finally, Robert was the first to speak. "Thank you for coming, Daniel," he said, his voice low and laden with emotion. Daniel nodded, trying to maintain a cool demeanor. "I came because I thought it was time we had this conversation. Not because—" He paused, trying to find the right words. "Not because I've gotten over what happened between us." Robert sighed deeply, as if he had expected this response. "I understand. And to be honest, I didn't expect it to be easy for you. But there are things I need to say, and I think it's only fair that you hear them." Daniel remained silent, allowing Robert to continue. He was curious to hear what his father had to say, but at the same time, he felt an internal resistance, a voice within him telling him not to be swayed too easily. "I was a terrible father, Daniel," Robert began, his voice trembling. "I know I disappointed you in many ways, especially after your mother passed away. I closed myself off from the world, from you. I thought I was being strong, but the truth is I was running from my own pain. And by doing that, I ended up pushing you away, precisely when you needed me the most." Daniel felt a lump in his throat but said nothing. He had rehearsed so many times what he would say, how he would throw all of Robert's mistakes back in his face. But now that the moment had finally arrived, the words seemed to escape him. Robert continued, "I know an apology won't erase the years of pain you've carried, but I need you to know that I deeply regret it. If I could go back in time, I would do everything differently. But since I can't, I'm here, asking for the chance to try to fix things." Looking at his father, Daniel saw the sincerity in his eyes. But he also saw something he had never noticed before: vulnerability. Robert, the man who always seemed so controlled and unshakable, was showing a side of himself that Daniel had never known. "Why now, Dad?" Daniel finally asked, his voice softer than he intended. "Why, after all these years, do you decide you want to fix things?" Robert averted his gaze, fixing it on the coffee cup in front of him. "Because time is passing, Daniel. I no longer have the illusion that I'm invincible. The years have taught me that the hard way. And well," he paused as if struggling to find the words, "my health isn't good. I'm sick, Daniel. Sick in a way that I may not have much time left." Daniel felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The anger and resentment he carried began to mix with a sense of fear and sadness that he didn't expect to feel. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice louder than he intended. Robert sighed, as if relieved to finally say it out loud. "I have a severe heart condition. The doctors said time isn't on my side. I know I caught you off guard with this call, but I needed to see you, needed to try to fix things before it's too late." The impact of these words hit Daniel hard. He had spent so much time focused on his own pain and anger that he never considered the possibility of losing his father without a chance for reconciliation. Now, faced with this reality, he found himself forced to reconsider everything. A whirlwind of emotions swept over Daniel. He wanted to scream, accuse his father of using his illness as a form of manipulation. But looking into Robert's eyes, he realized there was something more. A genuine desperation, a true desire for redemption. For the first time, Daniel saw his father as an imperfect man with flaws and regrets, not just as the villain in his life. Even so, he didn't know if he was ready to forgive. The pain was too deep, and the distrust had taken root over the years. But in that moment, he knew he had to make a decision. To continue holding onto resentment or to open a door for the possibility of healing. The rest of the meeting at the cafe unfolded in dense tension. Daniel, still stunned by his father's revelations, could barely pay attention to what Robert said afterward. The words "sick" and "not much time" echoed in his mind like a relentless siren. He realized that regardless of any rancor, he was being forced to face an inescapable truth. His father wouldn't be around much longer. When they said goodbye, Robert asked Daniel to consider spending a few days with him in Seattle, a final attempt to mend what had been broken. Daniel, still processing everything, didn't give an immediate answer, just agreed to think about it. As he got up to leave, Robert touched his son's shoulder with a gentleness Daniel didn't remember feeling before. "I know I caught you by surprise, Daniel, but thank you for coming. That already means a lot to me." Daniel simply nodded, unable to form a response. He left the cafe quickly without looking back, as if the urgency to leave that place was the only thought he could process. As he walked back to the car, the cold Seattle air cut his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was in turmoil, an internal battle between the desire to maintain the safe distance he had created and the need to give reconciliation a chance. During the long drive back to Portland, Daniel revisited in his mind the moments of his childhood and youth, trying to better understand the complex relationship he always had with his father. He remembered the silent afternoons when Robert would lock himself in his office, avoiding any interaction. He also remembered the nights when, trying to share some success or challenge, he was met with criticism or, worse still, total indifference. What Daniel never knew until now, however, was what lay behind all those cold reactions. Robert's revelation about the depression he faced after Claire's death was an unexpected blow. Daniel had always believed that his father simply didn't care enough to be a warm presence in his life. Now, he found himself confronted with the possibility that Robert was dealing with his own silent battles, unable to ask for help or show weakness. When he arrived home, Daniel felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling as his mind continued to whirl. It was clear that his relationship with his father had been far more complex than he allowed himself to recognize. And now, with Robert sick, the opportunity for a deeper understanding and perhaps reconciliation was in front of him. In the days that followed, Daniel found himself increasingly consumed by thoughts of his father. He tried to focus on work, but was constantly distracted by memories of the meeting at the cafe. What Robert had said about time running out echoed in his head. Daniel couldn't ignore the fact that if he didn't make a decision soon, he might lose the last chance to heal his wounds. Finally, on a sleepless night, Daniel got up and began pacing the apartment. He opened a bottle of wine, but even as he took the first sip, he knew it wouldn't be enough to calm the storm inside him. He picked up his phone and, almost without realizing it, dialed Robert's number. The phone rang only twice before being answered. "Daniel." Robert's voice sounded surprised, as if he didn't expect to hear back so soon. "Hi, Dad," Daniel replied, his voice calmer than he felt inside. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about spending time together." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Daniel could almost imagine Robert holding his breath. "And have you decided?" Daniel closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "Yes, I'll come. I think maybe it's important for both of us." Robert exhaled a sigh of relief that seemed to carry years of weight. "Thank you, son. I won't force you to do anything, but just the fact that you're willing to try is more than I could ask for." They arranged the details of the trip, and when Daniel hung up the phone, he felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He knew it wouldn't be an easy visit, that old wounds might be reopened, but he also felt that there was something more at stake, something he needed to face in order to move forward, with or without his father. The following days passed in a blur as Daniel prepared for the trip. He got his work in order, notified close friends, and in the blink of an eye, he was back on the road, this time headed to Robert's house in Seattle. When Daniel arrived at Robert's house, he was greeted by a silence that seemed almost palpable. The house was a small property on the outskirts of Seattle, surrounded by tall trees that blocked the view of other houses. Daniel had never visited the place before, and as he looked around, he noticed the simplicity of the decor. There was no ostentation, just old furniture and a few framed photographs on the walls. Every corner seemed to carry a story, a part of his father's life that he had never known. Robert greeted him at the door with a timid smile, visibly relieved to see him. "Thank you for coming, Daniel. I hope the trip was smooth." Daniel nodded, trying to hide the unease he felt. "It was. And you, how are you feeling?" Robert hesitated for a moment, as if he didn't want to worry his son. "I have good days and not so good ones, but I'm holding up. Let's go inside. I'll prepare something for us to eat." They sat in the kitchen, a cozy space with a time-worn wooden table. While Robert prepared some tea, Daniel observed his father's slow movements. It was evident that he was more fragile than the last time they saw each other. Time and illness had taken their toll. As they sat at the table, there was an uncomfortable silence. Both knew there was much to be said, but they didn't know where to begin. Daniel decided to break the ice. "Dad, I want to be honest with you," he began, looking directly into Robert's eyes. "I'm still trying to process all of this. I'm still angry. I'm still hurt. But I'm here because I think I need to understand better what happened between us." Robert nodded, his expression serious. "I understand, Daniel, and I'm here to listen to what you have to say, without judgment." Daniel took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I've always wondered why you never—" He hesitated, searching for the correct expression. "Why you never seemed to care. I tried so many ways to please you, to be the son you wanted, but nothing seemed to be enough. And after Mom died, it was like you completely shut down on me." Robert lowered his gaze, clearly touched by Daniel's words. "I know, son, and I hate myself for it. The truth is, after your mother died, I simply didn't know how to deal with the loss. She was my pillar, the person who kept me grounded. When she was gone, I lost my way, and instead of seeking help or trying to be strong for you, I sank into my own pain." Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. Hearing his father admit this was something he never expected. "But why didn't you ever tell me this before? I spent years thinking it was my fault, that I wasn't good enough." Robert looked at him with eyes full of sadness. "I didn't know how, Daniel. I've always been a proud man, and admitting that I was broken was something I simply couldn't do. I thought that if I pretended everything was okay, somehow things would work out. But that only pushed you further away." Robert's confession brought a wave of emotions to Daniel. He wanted to scream, to accuse his father of ruining his childhood. But he also saw, for the first time, Robert's humanity. He wasn't the monster Daniel had painted in his mind, but a flawed man, lost in his own pain. "What do you want from me now, Dad?" Daniel asked, his voice soft but firm. "Do you want me to just forget everything and pretend nothing happened?" Robert slowly shook his head. "No, Daniel. I don't expect you to forget. And I know forgiveness is a difficult choice, maybe impossible for you at this moment. What I want is for you to give me a chance to show that I'm a different man now, that I've learned from my mistakes. I know we don't have much time, but I want to use it to build something we never had, a real father-son relationship." The weight of Robert's words hit Daniel like a sledgehammer. He realized that as much as he wanted to deny it, part of him longed for this reconciliation. He knew that holding on to the anger and resentment wouldn't bring peace, but letting it all go also felt like a betrayal to the young man he once was, the one who suffered so much at the hands of an absent father. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Dad," Daniel admitted, his voice breaking a little. "But I'm willing to try, at least. I at least want to understand more about you, about what happened, and why things were the way they were." Robert nodded, a tear running down his face. "That's all I can ask for, Daniel. Thank you for giving me this chance." In the days that followed, Daniel and Robert began spending more time together. They walked around the neighborhood, talked about life, and gradually, Daniel began to discover more about the man who had always been a mystery to him. They reminisced about Daniel's childhood, some of which he didn't even remember, and at other times, they openly discussed the mistakes of the past. As the days went by, Daniel and Robert grew closer in a way neither of them had ever imagined possible. The conversations that had once been hesitant and laden with pain became more open and sincere. Robert began sharing details of his life that Daniel had never known, revealing not just the traumas that shaped his personality, but also the regrets he had carried since Claire's death. One evening, while they were having dinner together, Robert stood up from the table and went to an old cabinet in the living room. He returned with a photo album, its edges worn by time. "I wanted to show you this," he said, opening the album carefully and placing it on the table in front of Daniel. Daniel looked at the photos. They were images of his childhood, moments he had forgotten or that were only vague memories in his mind. The photos showed a time when the family was still united, before his mother's death and the subsequent rupture between him and his father. But what caught his attention the most were the letters tucked between the pages of the album. "These letters," Robert began, his voice choked with emotion. "I wrote them to you over the years, but I never had the courage to send them. Each one is an attempt to express what I couldn't say out loud. I kept them all, hoping that one day I could give them to you in person. I think now is the right time." Daniel picked up one of the letters, his hands slightly trembling. He opened the envelope carefully and began to read. The words were hesitant, full of regret and guilt. Robert spoke about how much he missed Daniel, how deeply he regretted his failures as a father, and how much he wished he could turn back time to do things differently. As Daniel read, he felt a weight being slowly lifted from his shoulders. It was as if, for the first time, he could see his father as a vulnerable and imperfect human being, rather than the insensitive giant he had always thought him to be. He read letter after letter, each one revealing a little more about the internal struggle Robert had faced, his unspoken fears and hopes. Robert watched in silence, allowing Daniel to absorb everything at his own pace. When Daniel finally looked at him, there were tears in his eyes. "Why did you never send these letters?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Robert sighed, looking older than ever. "I was afraid, Daniel. Afraid that you weren't ready to hear it. Afraid that I had lost the chance to redeem myself. I've always been better with written words than spoken ones. But in the end, I was a coward. I thought that if I kept these letters, somehow I still had a chance. But now I see that I should have taken the risk earlier." Daniel was silent for a moment, Robert's words echoing in his mind. He never imagined that his father had carried so many regrets, and for the first time, he felt a true connection with him. It was no longer a relationship based solely on a painful past, but on a mutual understanding of their flaws and vulnerabilities. I think I understand now, Dad," Daniel finally said, breaking the silence. "I understand why things were the way they were. And although it's not easy, I want to try to forgive you. Not for your sake, but for mine. I don't want to carry this anger forever." Robert smiled, a sad smile, but full of gratitude. "That's more than I could have hoped for, Daniel. I just want you to know that, despite everything, I always loved you. Even when I couldn't show it, that love was always there." Daniel nodded, feeling that for the first time in years, he was beginning to heal. It wouldn't be a quick or simple process, but he was ready to move forward, to leave behind the pain he had carried for so long. In the days that followed, Daniel continued to explore the photo album and letters, each one revealing more layers of the man he thought he knew. He and Robert spent hours talking about the past, recalling good and bad moments, and little by little, they began to build new memories together. Robert, for his part, seemed more at peace. Although his health continued to deteriorate, there was a lightness in his expression that Daniel had never seen before. He and Daniel began to develop a simple but meaningful routine. Short walks around the block, long conversations at sunset, and sometimes just shared silence, which was now no longer uncomfortable, but rather comforting. For Daniel, those weeks with his father were a transformative experience. He had arrived in Seattle full of anger and resentment, but was leaving with a new perspective on life, forgiveness, and love. He realized that although the scars of the past would never completely disappear, they didn't have to define his future. One night, as they watched an old movie together, Robert turned to Daniel and said, "Thank you for giving me this chance, son. I don't know how much time I have left, but every moment we've spent together has already been worth it." Daniel looked at his father and, for the first time in years, felt a true inner peace. "I'm grateful too, Dad. I think I finally understand that, despite everything, you did the best you could." The two hugged, an embrace that symbolized the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another, where understanding and forgiveness replaced pain and resentment. The days in Seattle passed quickly, and Daniel's time with his father, though short, was deeply meaningful. The relationship they had built in those weeks, based on honesty and acceptance, brought a sense of peace that neither had felt in a long time. Robert was increasingly frail, but there was a serenity in his expression that Daniel had never seen before. One morning, Robert called Daniel to sit with him on the porch. The sun was rising, painting the sky with soft shades of pink and orange. Robert looked at the horizon for a long time before speaking. "Daniel, I want you to know that I'm at peace now," he said, his voice calm and steady. "These days we've spent together have been a gift to me, something I never thought I'd have the chance to experience. I know I can't change the past, but I hope you can move forward with a lighter heart." Daniel held his father's hand, feeling the fragility in Robert's fingers. "I'm at peace too, Dad. I think I finally understand that, despite all the mistakes, you always loved me in your own way. And that's what matters now." They sat in silence for a while, just appreciating each other's company. Daniel knew that his time with Robert was coming to an end, but he was grateful for every moment they had shared. He felt that, no matter what happened next, he was ready to face the future with a new perspective. That night, Robert went to bed earlier than usual. Daniel helped him settle in, and before leaving the room, Robert called him back. "Daniel, there's one last thing I want to ask of you." "Anything, Dad?" Daniel replied, approaching the bed. "I want you to live your life fully," Robert said, with a serene expression. "Don't let the past hold you back. I did that for too long, and I know how destructive it can be. I want you to be happy, to build your own memories, and to forgive yourself as well." Daniel felt a tear escape his eyes as he held his father's hand. "I will, Dad. I promise." Robert smiled softly, closing his eyes. "Thank you, son. I love you." "I love you too, Dad," Daniel replied, his voice choked with emotion. That night, as Daniel sat in the living room, he felt a strange sense of tranquility spreading through the room. He knew, somehow, that this would be his father's last night. He quietly climbed the stairs and found Robert sleeping peacefully. When he touched his shoulder lightly, he realized that he had already passed away. Robert died in peace, surrounded by the love he and Daniel had managed to rediscover. Although the loss was painful, Daniel felt a deep gratitude for having had the opportunity to reconcile with his father before his death. He knew that this experience had changed his life forever. After the funeral, Daniel returned to Portland, taking with him the photo album and the letters Robert had kept for so many years. He knew that these memories would be an important part of his healing journey. And as he drove back home, he felt that something inside him had changed. The anger and resentment he had carried for so long were replaced by a serene acceptance and a desire to live his life differently. In the months that followed, Daniel began reconnecting with other family members and friends he had distanced himself from over the years. He allowed himself to be more open, more vulnerable, and discovered that by doing so, his relationships became deeper and more meaningful. He also decided to seek professional help to work through the emotions that still lingered, understanding that forgiveness and healing were ongoing processes. Daniel realized that Robert's legacy wasn't just the difficult past they had shared, but also the ability to overcome adversity and find peace, even in the most challenging circumstances. He strove to live by that lesson, and over time, he became a more compassionate and resilient person. As he looked to the future, Daniel knew there would still be challenges, but now he would face them with a new perspective. The reconciliation with his father had transformed his life in ways he could never have predicted, and he was determined to honor that transformation by living authentically and fully. And so, Daniel's life moved forward, but this time with a lighter heart and a more open soul to the possibilities the future held.